The Fishmen of Kandalinga by David Whitaker. Read by Matthew Jones. The face staring into the outer lens should have been terrifying to Doctor Who in the TARDIS, but it was so grotesque that it was comical. While he studied the image and increased magnification, he chuckled to himself. My word, our friend outside is definitely in urgent need of some beauty treatment. Now, just where in the universe have I landed? A world that breeds such clowns as this must be a very funny world indeed. The face was round and fat, like the face of a jolly man. The two eyes were set slightly to each side of a globular head. Two great staring, glassy eyes. A fringe of what looked like whiskers surrounded the face, and as he watched the mouth begin to open in a comical grin, it was then that Doctor Who realised that this denizen of an odd world was not by any means comical. For as the huge mouth opened, rows and rows of sharp white needle-like teeth were displayed, and the vast mouth clashed against the outer surface of the TARDIS. The space-time ship rocked and rolled from the force of the blow, and the Doctor clung desperately to the edge of his circular control panel. Small as the TARDIS was, this creature must be truly enormous if its mouth could deal such a blow. The surface outside ran into whirls and sinuous movements, and he was forced to the dismal conclusion, which he had first fought against, that his ship had materialised in water. Dear, dear, of course, the thing is mathematically certain that in so many, many strange journeys, landing on so many, many strange worlds, a moment would come when my ship would emerge from interdimensional non-space into a planetary environment occupied by water. Oh, dear, dear me, this does present many difficulties. I suppose that fellow out there, no matter how big he is really nothing but a fish. Ha ha! The thing had vanished, but others had taken its place, and the Doctor stayed where he was, fascinated by the multitude of strange creatures which thronged around his ship. Monstrous they might be, but very many of them were so beautiful that he found himself admiring them. Some of them were very fierce indeed, and attacked the TARDIS time and time again. The vehicle moved now only very sluggishly when struck, and he felt that maybe she was fast in mud. That would mean the bottom of this water, this sea or ocean or whatever it was. He should have felt terror and extreme concern at the very dangerous position he was in water of unknown depth and proportions. It might not even be water, he thought. He could recall other liquids on other worlds he had seen, where there had been seas of acid, seas of liquid gases even. There would have to be a moment when he would start to worry, but that moment was not yet. He was too fascinated by the infinite variety and beauty of the scenes before his eyes, eerie and monstrous though they might be. The colours of the creatures and the trailing plants outside in the liquid included every shade of the spectrum, and some which he suspected might even be outside the known spectrum of his own universe. In some of the faces, bestial though they undoubtedly were, there seemed to be a hint of a haunting shadow of humanity. The eyes of the true fishes were glassy and quite without expression, but there were some which came very close and made no attempt to attack, which held in their depths expressions which he fought desperately in his mind to understand. Recalled to sanity, he ran his fingers over the preliminary buttons which would test the outside environment. If that stuff outside was acid, then this would surely be the shortest visit the TARDIS had made to any world, for the strange metals out of which she was made were proof against most elements in nature, but he did not intend to test whether they were proof against acids. If the liquid outside was not water, then TARDIS must take off again. His fears on that score were soon calmed, for the liquid outside was definitely water, just as much H2O as any sea or river on Earth. So he did have a breathing space at least. The space-time ship would not be eaten away by acid. The fact that his ship was completely submerged in water did not worry him very much just now. The TARDIS was quite watertight. What did nag at his mind was the fact that the vessel had no way of movement, except in its own quite mysterious motion in space or time. She had no wheels or tractor treads. If he wanted to take the TARDIS out of this watery grave in which he had materialised, he would have to do it by the only way there was, namely to shift her completely out of this world. Or, if he remained in this world, he must shift her in time, either backwards or futurewards, and the Doctor was very reluctant to leave this strange world before he knew something about it. Now his fingers began to play gleefully over the controls. Nothing would be lost by a little experiment. He would put his ship through her paces. A ship which could transport itself instantaneously across millions of miles, a ship which could materialize millions of years in the past or future, should have little difficulty in travelling a few 100 miles or a few 100 years past or future. Never before had he ever attempted anything like this, but now his mastery over the wonders of his ship was growing, and anyway, he had little choice. There was no way out of the ship into the water, and those choice specimens out there were gathering in ever-increasing numbers, many of them looking very fierce indeed. He moved a final lever, and the watery scene faded from the sight screens. A moment later he heaved a sigh of relief as he saw landscape outside and not seascape. He pressed the lever which would open the great door. He would never be satisfied until he'd stepped out onto the surface of this world which was new to him. His instruments had told him that while the TARDIS had moved several thousands of miles, she was still in the same time as before. His vessel rested on a flat surface of what looked like concrete, though it was smoother by far, and was many-coloured. Tall pillars of the same material ran in straight lines parallel with each other as far as the eyes could see, and they ran along what looked like an ocean, which stretched to the horizon itself. He began to walk through the avenues of pillars, and in doing so received the greatest shock he'd ever had, almost falling into one of them. He stared aghast at the sight of the thing that lay in the oblong grave set into the concrete. It was completely immersed in water, and the eyes were closed, but it was man-shaped in that it had a head, 2 arms and 2 legs. There the resemblance ceased, for the thing was covered with scales. It had gills at each side of its neck, and 2 more at the waist. The lower limbs were webbed, and the whole body seemed to be covered with tendrils that floated in the sluggish, green-tinted water in which it was immersed. He walked a pace and saw yet another water-filled pit like the first, then another and yet another. All along the causeway, between the colonnade of pillars, there were these shallow tanks, and in each of them there was one of the peculiar creatures. Hundreds and hundreds of them there were, all with eyes closed, and all of them still, except for the sluggish movement of the water. He stood erect and stared round him. He could see now that truly he had landed on a causeway. Not more than a few 100 feet wide, it stretched to his left out of sight, and to his right out of sight. To either side was what looked like everlasting ocean. Then he heard the sound, like a great horn or conch. It sounded from over the sea in a deep, hollow, moaning noise. 3 times it was repeated, and then silence. Doctor Who stared all around him and up into the sky, but he could see nothing. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement at the edge of the water pits, and fascinated he watched the creatures climb up onto the smooth, vari-coloured pavement. He looked at the one nearest to him. It stood to its full height, dripping water, and it was not above 4 feet in height. The scales glistened in the light of a small sun just rising from the horizon. The tendrils lay like wet hair against the silvery scales, but Doctor Who noted that as they dried, they began to wave in a warm breeze that had sprung up. Warily he moved away, and, crouching down, regained the TARDIS. He did not enter, but closed the great door, put the electronic key round his neck on a chain, and hid behind the vessel. What he saw as he hid there made his eyes bulge. From pit after pit the creatures crawled and shook themselves like dogs shaking the water from themselves. They made no sound. There was no noise coming from their wide mouths. Although many of them were facing the TARDIS and must have seen it, it seemed to excite no attention in them. It was as though there was nothing there. Then the great horn sounded again across the water, and the ship came. It was big by any standards, and was shaped like a vast barge. Of its method of propulsion there was no sign, and Doctor Who was forced to the strange conclusion that the ship must fly and rise and fall by anti-gravity. This was a principle he'd never encountered before on any world he'd visited, although obviously the thing had been used when the TARDIS was originally fabricated. The vast ship settled on the water as gently as a feather, and Doctor Who saw an immediate reaction among the creatures from the water pits. Just like soldiers, they began to form up into lines facing one side of the causeway. They stood perfectly still except for the waving of their drying tendrils, and they appeared to be waiting for a signal. If signal there was, it made no sound to the listener's ears, yet suddenly he was startled as the front rank of the creatures dived head first into the sea, to be followed by the second rank, and then the third, and so on. Inside a moment the whole crowd had vanished, and Doctor Who was alone. His attention had been taken by the beings on the barge itself. They were totally black, heads, bodies, faces and limbs. There was a deep nagging in his mind about them. Of course, they were too far away for him to see any detail, but even so his mind was troubled. These black beings had some special sort of significance. He knew that within himself. When all the creatures had vanished beneath the waves, the ship rose, and, travelling only a few feet above the water, proceeded slowly across the wide expanse, travelling at right angles to the causeway. Doctor Who, watching, could see beneath it a great wash of white foam, and something told him that the great throng of creatures from the water pits were swimming not far below the surface. It was leading them somewhere. Suddenly it felt cold. Walking across the coloured pavements, he looked into several of the pits, all empty now. A feeling of loneliness swept over him, like a sudden cold gripping his vitals. He was used enough to being alone, he told himself, but after that great throng of creatures had gone, he felt more alone than he had ever felt before. The causeway stretched endlessly in either direction, with a double line of columns dwindling to vanishing point at either end. Where did it lead to? He could not walk to the end of it at either direction. It must stretch for hundreds of miles. And it had been built. That was obvious now. This thing had been built on pilings driven into the bottom of a no doubt shallow sea. Who had built it, and for what purpose? Morosely he retreated to his ship, and going inside closed the great door. His forward sight screen was set to that portion of the causeway upon which he had walked, and after he had eaten and rested, he set himself to watch. The small sun climbed up into the sky until it was at its zenith. Its light was quite pale now, but at what would be midday he became conscious of a new and more brilliant light shining through a dense cloud envelope. This planet must have two suns. One, a small one, the light of which, though appearing pale, was in reality so brilliant that it could penetrate through dense clouds. Further away would be a giant sun of much greater power, but at such a distance that its greater light did not penetrate the clouds. It would be like that on Venus, in the Earth system, he reflected. Could this planet be almost entirely covered with water? The second sun rose into the cloudy sky, and was well past its zenith when the first sun had sunk beneath the far horizon. Now once again he heard the great conch or horn. It moaned across the empty sea like some lonely sea monster keening out its sorrows across the ocean, and the barge came back. With no sound, no smoke, it glided across the sea and hovered close to the edge of the causeway. Immediately there was a flurry in the water all along the causeway, and the strange creatures he had seen now began climbing back up. This time they did not shake themselves, but each sought one of the pits in the pavement and slid into the water. All along the causeway they were doing this, and the glow from the clouds was nearly darkening when they'd all vanished, and the causeway was just as it had been when the TARDIS had first landed. He dragged his attention from a now empty causeway and stared out to the barge. It was taking off again after hovering, and now Doctor Who was able to see more clearly what or who these mysterious black beings were. His heart misgave him as he recognized them. It had been a long time, but not to him, since he had first seen these creatures. That had been on Marinus, millions of years in the past or future, he'd never found out, but he could not be mistaken. There was the completely enveloping black outline of the creatures, that odd thing protruding from their heads at the front, and the two horns, almost like ears at each side of the head to the back. The crew of the flying barge belonged to that race dreaded above all else on Marinus, the mysterious race known as the Vord. Doctor Who knew little about these mysterious beings. All his dealings had been with Arbiton, the leader of the humans on Marinus, which, on the occasion of the Doctor's visit, had been fighting the Vord for mastery of the planet. Now, if this world which he had now entered was not Marinus, what were they doing here? His curiosity got the better of his good sense, and he opened the great door again. Standing near the edge of the causeway, he stared out towards the Vord barge. He saw it hovering, then settle again a few feet from the surface. Like one in a dream, he watched it approach, and as fascinated was he by his curiosity that he did not notice how far he had walked from the ship. The barge had appeared to be moving slowly, but now to his horror it shot like an arrow towards the causeway. In a blur it moved, and then stopped. It was now between himself and the ship. His curiosity had indeed been his undoing. 4 black figures leapt down from the ship and approached him. There was nothing to be gained by struggling. They took hold of him, not roughly, and led him to the ship. 2 of them holding him, they leapt on board as the barge glided away from the causeway. It rose into the air, and like an arrow sped fast across the waste of water into the eye of the setting sun. Doctor Who found himself standing facing a group of the Black Vord, all standing perfectly motionless, faceless, black, and unspeaking. With what dignity he could find, he smoothed down his clothes, thrust back his white hair, and screwed his monocle into his eye. "And what, may I ask, is the meaning of this? Am I to regard myself as a prisoner?" Although he did not intend to give his captors the satisfaction of knowing it, his mind was working furiously on the problem of his ship. Left there, high and dry on the causeway, amidst those water-pits filled with the small sea monsters. True, they'd made no moves to come near him or his ship when he'd first arrived. In fact, they'd appeared not even to see it at all. Oddly enough, neither had the Vord, he told himself. It was all very odd, very strange indeed. "Well, sir?" he said severely, addressing the foremost being on the barge deck. Across his mind floated a succession of dim pictures coming from he knew not where, and he heard a slight sound. It was hardly a voice, more like a sigh, and it came from the creature before him. It was like a voice, yet not like a voice. The words seemed to come to him from far off, as though uttered by a creature quite unused to speech. "Who are you, strange monster, and where have you come from? You are not native to this world. How did you come? We saw no ship, and never have we seen a creature like you before. There were legends on our old home of creatures like you. They came to that world where we lived, and, the legend says, they helped the Arbitans to overpower our race, so that they were able to cast us out of Marinus. Speak! Who or what are you, and whence came you?" Instantly the Doctor knew that there was danger here from the Vord. He called the dominant race on Marinus the Arbitans. It must be now many millions of years since his last visit to that planet, when he had aided the leader Arbitan to overthrow the evil Vord. These Vord called the triumphant race of their world the Arbitans. No doubt of the passing of the centuries, the whole race had assumed the name of the great dead leader. If these Vord ever became convinced that he was in reality the very being who had engineered their downfall, then they would give him short shrift. But he felt reasonably certain they would not know this. The creature had whispered of legends. Many, many years had passed, and none of these Vord living now would ever dream of connecting him with the mysterious creature who had visited their old planet. On that last visit the Vord had never even seen his TARDIS, and it looked now as though they did not even recognize it as a vehicle. He tried a confident laugh. "I know nothing of what you speak. I am a visitor from another world. and I am puzzled by this planet. What is its name? Are you the ruling race here? Who are those creatures in the water pits?"
"You ask many questions for one who is in our power."
The black being moved an arm, and two of the wards seized the captive and threw him down on the deck. Protesting furiously, Doctor Who found himself being chained to a mast. He shouted and raved and tore at the chains, but none of the wards seemed even to hear him, and gradually he calmed down and began to examine his surroundings. Oddly enough, he finally decided that perhaps the creatures did not really hear him. He could see no evidence that any of them spoke to each other. There was no sound from any of them as they went about their duties. The barge sped on across the sea, and presently a flat plate of what looked like food was put in front of the doctor. Critically he examined it and turned up his nose. An hour later he touched it, and found the mess was slimy and smelt like fish. Obvious enough on a world like this. But it was raw. Did they expect him to eat this? Another hour, and after seeing many of the ward eating what looked like the same kind of food, he conquered his abhorrence, and picking it up, tried to force some of the fishy, flesh-like food into his starving mouth. The reality was much worse than the anticipation. He gagged and almost vomited as the flesh, cold and slimy, uncooked and fishy, refused to stay in his mouth. He gave a loud, angry yell, and he was very surprised at the reaction. Those Vord who happened to be close to him cringed away back from him as though in great pain. All the black beings on the barge deck looked at him, and the one who had spoken came over.
"If you will not eat this flesh, you will starve, unless you can live on plankton, which I doubt."
"This stuff will make me sick." The Vord flinched a little. Doctor Who, searching that black mask-like head, could see no evidence of eyes or nose or ears, yet the creature obviously spoke and heard, saw and smelled.
"We are nearing home. Have patience. We will see what is to be done for you on our island. And also you must speak much lower than you do. Your normal loud, harsh noises are able to do much harm to the sensitive structure of my people."
Doctor Who digested all this, and decided he must remember that bit about the noise. It might come in very useful later on. These beings must have something like the radar hearing of bats on Earth. They did not speak, though this one could, but all could hear. Now that he was closer to them, he could observe better the strange organs on their heads. The one in front, like a circle, was divided, and there were two loops at each side of the head at the back. These people must be telepathic. It was the only solution to the puzzle. That odd circular organ was the transmitter of the thought-speech. Following on with this thought, the doctor guessed that it was also the way by which they spoke to the strange creatures in the water pits. The barge had by now landed on what looked like an island. It was obviously artificial, appearing like a round dome built on the bottom of the sea, its peak being the island. The low voice came into his mind, and in it was a sharp bitterness.
"We are home. This is our home. Our only home on this inhospitable planet."
The whole thing was so odd to the doctor that he made no reply, but waited. He was unchained, and two of the black beings hustled him ashore. There were no buildings on this artificial island, and he deduced these weird creatures must live underground. This was soon proved true, for he was taken down a flight of steps which led into the bowels of the island. There were lights here and there, pale lights, which he suspected would be phosphorescents rather than mechanical or electrical. The smell was overpowering. He almost choked, as the fishy smell came to him with full force. He was hustled along a passage and past several open doors into rooms with lights. From these rooms the fishy smell came with added pungence, and he caught glimpses of what looked like sides of meat hanging on railings where Vords worked amongst them. He was hurried along so fast he could make out few details, but a horrible suspicion was born in his mind at sight of these hanging slabs of meat. Then he was in a room alone with the Vord who had spoken to him on the barge. The room was like a concrete bunker with no furniture. Doctor Who shivered as he stood there with the odd creature. Roughly man-shaped as the being was, he seemed to be as far from humanity as any race he'd ever encountered. How did they live down here in these concrete warrens? What sort of civilization did they have? There seemed to be no points of contact between himself and them.
You say you are from another world. So, strange creature, are we. We are not native to Kandalinga. We came through space to this world, hoping to find a refuge here after we had been cast out of our native world.
Your native world was named what?
We called it Marinus. The Arbitans fought us for mastery of Marinus, and they defeated us. A few hundred of us, the survivors, put aboard a spaceship, and we came here. There is no land whatsoever on this world, stranger, and we landed on the water. By titanic efforts we converted the wrecked spaceship into our barge, and with this as our only weapon, we set out to make a world fit for us to inhabit.
Doctor Who stared at the creature thunderstruck. A world entirely of water, and a few hundreds of these beings had embarked on the impossible project of manufacturing solid land on which they could live. Then, suddenly, he remembered the creatures in the water pits. These beings were the slaves of these black monsters. He had seen them called from their waterbeds and guided through the water to some unknown destination. For an instant the Doctor had a glimpse of thousands of these fish beings engaged below ground in some monstrous process by which the waters could be held back and dry land emerge, or else some gigantic process of actually building from artificial materials the pilings on which habitable land might be fabricated, such as the giant causeway on which he had landed, and this circular island dome. But here his mind boggled. He was thinking of the processes that were familiar in his own home world. It must be very different here on this odd world, and very probably he would never gain any clues as to how these weird races lived and thought and acted. The creatures in the water pits on the causeway where you found me, who are they, and what sort of life do they lead?
They are the amphibian creatures we found. They are the dominant species here. They can live out of the water, but must spend some time each day in water. They are our slaves, and we will use them to make ourselves a home on this world, a home where we can grow our natural food. Then, when we have completed our greatest task and their usefulness to us is ended, we will destroy them, every one. For we will populate this world with our own race. Then, at some time in the future, we will cross space again, and we will take our revenge on the wicked Arbitans who threw us out.
Doctor Who brooded a long time on the softly spoken words. They told him many things. His stomach heaved again at the thought of the revolting food they'd expected him to eat. He recalled the lighted room with the hanging slabs of meat. Now he knew what happened to the creatures in the water pits when they were no longer useful for work. A second Vord had entered the room. He had a large metal case. He put it on the floor in front of a Vord who was obviously the leader. For a while the leader ignored it and went on talking.
Where is your ship, stranger? If you have come across space, as we did long ago, there are maybe many things in which you can help us in our enterprise. Your ship must be filled with engines which can help us. Our plan is a gigantic one, and sometimes every so often we quail at the enormity of the task. But it is the survival of the fittest, and we can only go on trying.
Meanwhile enslaving the native race of this world, enslaving them and planning their extinction in the future, meanwhile eating their flesh. To me, sir, that is cannibalism. The Vord stiffened a little. There was no way by which the Doctor could guess at its emotions, for the face was quite without features.
When we came, there was no land and no food for us. We were forced to eat these creatures. They are but fish. Where is your argument? The fittest and strongest must survive.
But there are only a few of you, Vord. There must be millions of the Fishmen. Do they submit tamely to your atrocities?
There have been uprisings. We have had to wipe out many thousands of them at one time or another. But they breed rapidly, and we are never short of slaves or food. Enough of this. You will take me to your spaceship at once. We waste time.
He bent down to the case, and Doctor Who's eyes bulged as he saw what it contained. His mind went back to his first visit to the planet Marinus. There, in nests of red metal, were 2 of the famous keys of Marinus. There had been 4 originally, or 5, he tried to remember. Their possession and use had been sought by Arbiton and his people in their struggle with the mysterious Vord for possession of a vast complex of machines which could control Marinus. Arbiton had succeeded with Doctor Who's help, but somehow later the Vord had obtained 2 of the keys, it seemed. No doubt they were among the sacred relics of this exiled race. He knew he must show no interest in the keys, and with a creature like this Vord it was doubly difficult in that Doctor Who had no way of knowing whether the Vord could read his mind. Actually, he had made up his mind that it was not so, otherwise the being would not have been telling him all it did. If it had been able to read the Doctor's mind, it would have known who he was, and of his previous intervention in the affairs of Marinus. Now the Vord had taken 2 objects out of the case, and again the Doctor knew what they were, and at sight of them his heart leapt. Here was his way of escape. With one of these he could regain his ship, and at last shake the dust, or rather the water, of this strange planet Kandalinga from his feet.
We also brought these with us from our home,
came a voice inside the Doctor's head. Like wristwatches, the Doctor well remembered these marvellous things. Personal travel machines. He'd used these ingenious gadgets when he'd worked with Arbiton on Marinus. He saw that the Vord had clasped one of them round his wrist and was holding out the other to the Doctor.
You will take me to where your spaceship is. You will give me all its secrets, and you will help me master this planet.
Alone?
We go alone. My fellows are mere cattle. They have little stomach for what I am trying to do. Without me they would succumb to the Fishmen. With me at their head, and with your ship, I shall be master of this world. We shall build land and islands, and we shall hunt the Kandalingas out of their oceans.
And suppose I refuse to take you? The Doctor knew he must not seem too eager or willing to do as the other suggested.
If you refuse, you will be fed to the monsters which people these oceans. Be sure I shall find your ship sooner or later, wherever it is on this world.
It seems I have no choice then. Doctor Who clasped the travel machine to his wrist. My ship is on the causeway where you found me.
That is a lie. There is no ship there. If you try to trick me, strange monster, I will know what to do with you. Where is your ship again, I ask?
It is on the causeway. My ship is a most peculiar craft. You would not know it for a spaceship. It travels in... He pulled himself up short, dismayed at his own slip. If he gave away any hint the TARDIS travelled in time as well as space, the Vord might begin to think and remember about Marinus.
I must trust you then, for a while.
The Vord came closer to him and lifted the Doctor's arm. A wave of cold swept over the Doctor as the creature set the dials on the travel machine.
You will go ahead, and I shall be immediately behind you.
Doctor Who pressed the button on the travel machine, and instantly the concrete bunker faded from his sight, and he stood again on the causeway with the pillars. The sun was setting now, and the fishmen were climbing up out of the water. The barge hovered near the causeway edge. Then the Vord leader stood beside him. His voice came, and now it was no longer soft, but hard and angry.
Who are you, monster? You have knowledge of these travel machines. I had not told you how to use it, and yet you knew. Who are you, and where did you come from?
The fishmen were surrounding them, their tendrils flowing in the wind. The Vord leader ignored them and approached Doctor Who menacingly. The Doctor knew that he must risk everything on one throw. Everything depended, he felt sure, on that telepathic organ on the Vord's head. He reached up his hand swiftly and seized the thing. The Vord struggled and gave a whimpering sound like that of a kitten. The organ broke off in Doctor Who's hands, and the fishermen rushed in. There was a miraculous change in their attitude. No longer were they limp and flaccid, like walking fishes. Now they acted like men. Men whose evolutionary progress had been from marine animals and not from mammals, as had happened on Earth. The Doctor knew that he had chosen aright, and that the planet of Kandalinga belonged to these creatures. They would be telepathic also, taking their orders from the Vord masters by means of the tendrils, which were their telepathic organs. The Vord whom he had deformed was wandering about aimlessly on the causeway, mewing like a cat. Apparently all his senses askew with the loss of his telepathic organ. He was soon surrounded by hordes of the fishmen, and he vanished from view. The Doctor, by this time, was in the doorway of his vessel, and as a horde of the fishmen rushed over, he closed the great doors. From the screens he watched them circling round the TARDIS, touching it, stroking it, very obviously with no idea what it was, or where the other of the strange creatures had vanished. Then their attention was diverted elsewhere. Doctor Who, watching, saw that more and more of them were diving into the water again. The barge of the Vord was still hovering there beside the causeway, but now hordes of the fishmen were clambering up to the decks. It looked very much as though the crew, small in number, would be overwhelmed. Doctor Who sighed, and going to his circular control panel, he set in motion the electronic processes which would effect his departure. It was rare indeed that he actually interfered very actively in the affairs of any of the strange worlds he'd visited. But this time he had had no choice. Once before his intervention had defeated the Vord, and now he hoped it would defeat them again, in this new world to which they had been exiled and which was obviously not fitted for their existence. Kandalinga, the world of water. It belonged entirely to the strange species of amphibian fishmen whom the invading Vord had enslaved. With their leader gone, it looked as though the surviving Vord would have little chance against the millions of fishmen there must be on the planet, kept in subjection by the telepathic organ of their dead leader, evidently much more powerful than those of his followers. The natives would very soon overpower their masters and regain control of their own destinies. As Doctor Who pulled down lever after lever, he watched the fishmen converging the flat deck of a Vord barge, and knew that he had been right. The Vord had been cruel and emotionless beings, careless of the rights of all other beings to safe existence. They were better out of the way. As the watery scene outside began to fade from his screens, the Doctor sighed heavily. Dearly would he have liked to know more of this strange world. What was the purpose of this odd causeway, for instance, with its marching lines of pillars travelling in either direction into infinity? What were the mysterious processes operated by their Kandalinga slaves, whereby the Vord had hoped to make land emerge from the shallow oceans? Probably some sort of electrolysis, he thought to himself, whereby the water would be transformed into gas, or oxygen, or hydrogen, thus allowing the dry land to emerge. That would take centuries, maybe thousands of years to do. He reflected soberly that the Vord leader had certainly been a most determined fellow. Maybe even he might have been worth knowing, if indeed there had been any way for human and Vord ever to get to understand each other. He dogged the final lever, and the screen cleared. Well, this surely is a most amazing universe. Now I wonder what will I find at the end of this journey. And the TARDIS vanished from the mysterious causeway, and the breezes blew over the world-wide oceans of the planet Kandalinga. Now, he hoped, freed from the grip of the invading Vord. Doctor Who, The Fishmen of Kandalinga, featured the first Doctor. It was written by David Whittaker for the 1966 Doctor Who Annual. It was read by me, Matthew Jones.